My name is Richard Kannwischer, and I am so excited to invite you to partner with me to go on a great journey to deepen your faith. Tom Wright is one of the greatest biblical scholars of a generation, and we have an opportunity for you. Through our website, you can go to peachtreechurch.com/dwell for the opportunity for you to be a part of a learning community. It is a class that Tom has written and delivered for you to be able to take online at any time you want to, for you individually or for you as a group, to be able to learn what does it mean to dwell in God's presence through the Psalms. There's 30 great sessions. You can break them up in any way you want to, and it's an unbelievable chance to learn from one of the greatest minds of a generation with the Bible. I look forward to joining you in the task. My name is Richard Kannwischer, and it is my privilege to be the senior pastor of the Peachtree Presbyterian Church in Atlanta, Georgia. And I am sitting here with...
I'm Tom Wright. I'm retired from pastoral ministry and academic work, and I'm now teaching part-time in Oxford and enjoying slightly more freedom to do a few other things as well.
That few other things involves sitting with us for this podcast in the midst of the breaks of all the different books and things that you are writing. Tom is a great historian and an incredible scholar, and is becoming a faithful and fast friend. So Tom, thanks for being with us as we learn how to discover to dwell with God in the Psalms.
Thank you. It's very good to be with you.
Tom, welcome back to our Peachtree podcast. And we're talking this month about relying on God in uncertain times. And we find ourselves in uncertain times right now. But let's be clear, this is not the only time in history when things have looked rather rocky and difficult. And many of these Psalms are written by David. And that was a particularly uncertain time, surrounding life. Help us to enter into the history of how kind of chaotic and difficult the time that brought up to the person of David was.
As with so many things in looking back in history, because we know the outcomes, it's easy to think, oh, well, it was always going to be like that, so what were they worried about? But at the time, after the Exodus and the long years of the Judges, there had been terrible things and foreign enemies coming in and Israel being faithless and worshipping idols and God having to rescue them, etc., etc. And the horror story, which is the book of Judges, basically. And as the book of Judges ends, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel and everyone just did that which was right in their own eyes, which is obviously an apologia for, so we really did need a king, didn't we? Which was a moot point, and not everyone thought that was a good idea at the time. And then they had Saul, and Saul was God's choice, and Saul blew it. And so, now is everything going to fall apart again? And meanwhile, God is quietly working behind the scenes, as it were, and here's this young man who's off keeping the sheep, and he turns out to be God's choice. And 1 Samuel, the Lord anoints David through the prophet Samuel, and the Spirit comes upon him. And the first thing he has to go and do is fight the giant, which is such a wonderful combination. If you're anointed with the Spirit, guess what? Here's a giant to fight. Now what are you going to do? It's a long time. And David is then an outcast from Saul's court. And if this is what's going on in the royal family or the newly made royal family, how are the rest of the people coping? Because the king is supposed to be their guardian, their judge, the one who fights their battles, and he's fighting his own servant. And that is really chaotic. And then when David finally does become king, after the Philistines have killed Saul and Jonathan, there are all sorts of groups that either don't want him or are still wanting the house of Saul instead. And so it's a really tough time, and uniting the people of God, to choosing Jerusalem as the capital, bringing the Ark of God to Jerusalem. That's dangerous in itself, as David knows only too well, and then deciding what to do about it. And then, of course, David himself doing what all God's people do sooner or later and blowing it completely and it all going horribly wrong. So the Psalms come out of that sense of a turbulent time. This is a small nation that's really struggling to be born still, struggling to hold together as a people. How are you going to do that? And what does that mean? And how are you going to learn the lessons of following the God who rescued you from Egypt when that already seems a long time ago? And it's as though, well, we heard these stories, but we're not quite sure what that was all about. And now we've got a tough time and we've got these wretched Philistines attacking us again. And so David is carving out a furrow of trust and hope and relying on God in those uncertain times. Nothing came as given. All sorts of things could have gone wrong, and some of them did.
So one of the things that your work has really helped me with, and I don't know that this was a particular book, but it was a consistent theme in a lot of your writings, was helping me to understand what in the Greek New Testament is called pistis, faith. I mean, what we tend to think of when we think of faith is intellectual assent to certain ideas. And yet you help us to really think of faith from a New Testament perspective. What does it mean to rely and trust? Help us to understand what faith really is.
Yeah, the Greek word pistis and the Latin word fides actually are such huge concepts, and they mean faithfulness, reliability, trustworthiness, as well as trust itself. So we have often narrowed that down, particularly in the Western Christian tradition, to, as you say, simply either faith has intellectual assent to certain propositions. I believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. Yeah, that's faith. But faith also as a sense of trust and relying on God, the faith with which we believe. And the theologians kind of tease those out. But actually, the root of faith is God's own faithfulness. And that's why Paul speaks about the pistis theou, or the pistis Christou, that God's faithfulness is that God has done what he promised, he will do what he promises, and therefore we answer to God with our faith. Not that faith is pinning our flag on God's map. It's saying, God is going to be faithful, right? I'm going to rely on that. And of course, that is used in certain propositions, it is used in certain feelings, but it goes deeper than any propositions or feelings, because it is about then knowing that God is reliable and then learning to be reliable ourselves. That pistis is reliability, faithfulness. I am sometimes challenged by this because I've written a lot about the faithfulness of God, and there are many times when I look at myself in the mirror and say, well, supposing God is asking about the faithfulness of Tom Wright, how's that one going? And so the whole thing works its way out as a considerable challenge. And as we find, I've got Psalm 91 in front of me. That's probably the one you were going to there.
Yeah, let's talk about Psalm 91, which is particularly important to you. Give people some of the backstory on why that's important to you.
My own backstory here is that this passage about he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler, he will shelter you with his wings, you will not fear the terror of the night or the pestilence of the darkness, 1,000 will fall at your side, but it won't come near you, you will only look on with your eyes. That for me inescapably reminds me of my father. My father signed up at the beginning of the Second World War to the regiment that his father, my grandfather, had been a colonel in. He was sent off to France with the early expeditionary force in late 1939. And in 1940, before Dunkirk, he was captured. And he saw a lot of his friends and contemporaries killed, wounded, missing in action, whatever. Somehow, extraordinarily, though he was marched around from one prison camp to another in Austria and Germany and finally Poland, somehow he survived. And so he was a prisoner of war from the age of just turning 20 through to 25. Knowing what I know about those years, that is extraordinary. And my father loved the Psalms, and he loved this one. And in Britain, we have a radio station that plays evensong, choral evensong once a week. And my dad would always turn that on, and he knew the Psalms by heart, and he would sing along with them or hum along with them. And so when he turned 91, because it was obvious he was not long for this world, I thought, what do you give somebody who's 91 and has been faithful all his life? I did a fresh translation of Psalm 91. And my father loved word games, and I did it in the form of an acrostic poem. So if you read it, the opening letter of each line read downwards, spelt "Happy Birthday, Dad." And I printed it out, my new translation of Psalm 91. And I said, "Here you are, Dad," and it's a puzzle. And he stared at it for 2 or 3 minutes, and then he suddenly said, "I've got it." But because it was all about him, and those who love me I will deliver, I will protect. And on their hands they will bear you up, that you dash not your foot against a stone. And then finally, with long life I will satisfy them and show them my salvation. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who dies young has been faithless. It
Right.
just means that in some cases this is a description of someone's life. And obviously for me it was a description of my own father. I can't sing it now without thinking of him.
And it may be one of the most beautiful images in all of these prayers. Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. What do you think that image means? That
It's like a vast tree or a great rock, where on a hot day, or when the weather's particularly bad, perhaps rain and storms and so on, here's a place we can shelter. And that God is like that, and these bad things are happening all around. And the Psalms are teaching us constantly, and we go on needing this. We go on finding ourselves in places where, how are we going to get through this next week, this next month, this next year? There's a crisis in the family or in the work or in the church or something. And learning that God is the rock, my fortress, my refuge, my God in whom I trust. Phew, again, it's the sigh of relief, which is what trust and faith is all about.
Yeah, it does. It connects to rest
Absolutely.
in that super well.
Absolutely.
In Psalm 130, one of the other psalms of this, this is one of my particular favorites, and I think it was there was a time in a choir when we would sing this psalm, out of the deep I call out to you, O God. And this image of more than watchmen wait for the morning, since most of us don't live as guards. What do you think that image meant to them in the ancient world?
Yes, I think of a medieval city, where I live in the middle of Oxford, where just outside where the city wall was, and in the Middle Ages, and before people had clocks and so on, you would have a watchman going around the walls shouting 2 in the morning or whatever, and the watchmen are waiting and watching for the first signs of dawn, watching on the battlements of the city, and so they will call to people when it's happening. And if, as they always say, the hours between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. are the slowest on the clock if you're awake during that period, and you didn't really want to be. I mean, some people have to work at that time, but if you're awake then you're longing for the morning. And the word soul here, let's be clear, this is not the Platonic soul. The Hebrew word nephesh means my innermost being. The person I really am in the presence of God, the deepest me that there is waiting and longing. And in his word, I hope, I'm remembering Scripture, I'm remembering the living word of God who is Jesus. And the night is long, and I'm just hanging in there, more than watchman for the warning. I'm waiting on the battlements. I don't know when the dawn is going to dawn. I'm just trusting that it will. As I've said about other psalms, when I reach Psalm 130 in my own private prayers, I put myself in the shoes of people in the Middle East, in Gaza, or in the Horn of Africa, with all the horrors that are going on there, or in the many other places in the world where it's just out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. I think we just have to link arms at that point and put our prayerful arms round the people in that situation. And we face our own Western variety of that, first world problems, as we say, and they're real. They can be killers themselves. But then I think this psalm enables us to pray with the whole people of God, with the whole human race, calling to God out of the depths.
So one of the terms that comes in this psalm and repeats often is, and it's one of the most important of the Hebrew words to help people understand the idea of unfailing love, hesed, here. So Israel, put your hope in the Lord, for with the Lord is unfailing love. It's almost hard for us to translate this word, so help us to unpack it.
Yeah, that lovely word chesed, which comes in one of the other psalms this month, Psalm 85, where chesed and emet, mercy and truth, meet together. I often have to explain to people when they're learning, usually in my case, New Testament Greek for the first time, that we assume that languages have words that are exact equivalents, because a table or a horse or a chin or something, that is what it is. But in the ancient Israelite world, they have this hesed, which means God's faithful, steadfast, merciful love. And it's to do with an all-embracing sense of the powerful love of God, which is never going to let us down. Fancy being able to concentrate that into a little word of 3 consonants, hesed. And so it resonates through. Of course, it's a favorite word in the Psalms, it's a favorite word in Isaiah, etc. There isn't really a Greek equivalent, so the Septuagint sometimes translates it by eleos and by sometimes by agape, sometimes by various other things. The love and mercy of God, that's what it's all about.
So in Psalm 18, you have this very concrete image. So God's his help in times of trouble, and it's almost as if he can take on a whole troop and he can scale the wall. But this isn't happening by his own power.
It is a psalm out of distress, verse 6, in my distress I called upon the Lord, and he heard me from the temple. My cry reached his ears. There's a promise in 1 Kings 8 when Solomon is dedicating the temple, that wherever his people are, when they pray towards this house, he will hear them. And so I sense Psalm 18 coming from somewhere a long way away, but he's looking towards the temple, rather like Daniel in Babylon, keeping his window open towards Jerusalem, even though the temple is in ruins while he's there. But that sense of God has promised to be present with his people. He's promised to put his name there, and he will always be available. When my kids were teenagers, I used to say to them, please don't phone me on such and such and such and such. I'll be busy, but if it's really urgent, here's the number to call. And I used to say if I was teaching a tutorial, if the phone went, I'd say, if that's one of my kids, I'm taking this. I think that's the promise there, that in Psalm 18 is, he'll be there when you call. He will be on hand in my distress. And he will then move heaven and earth to come and do what is needed. The earth reeled and rocked. The foundations of the mountains trembled and quaked. God said, this is one of my kids calling. I've got to go and do something about it. And it's a wonderful, wonderful image. And then the description, then the strength that the psalmist has because of that. Oh, he's coming to my help. I can therefore do this. It's a psalm of God to the rescue, enabling me to resist and win. It's wonderful.
We talked about the word hesed, God's unfailing love and kindness and mercy. And there is this image in Psalm 85 of love and faithfulness meet together. Righteousness and peace kiss each other. It's a shocking image of the idea of righteousness and peace coming together in the form of a kiss.
It's a fabulous image. And apart from anything else, and I guess I have this in my head because I've done quite a lot of work over the last few years on worldviews and how the normal Western worldview is of a normally absent God who might occasionally look down but normally lets the world go on and do its own thing. And this is about heaven and earth coming together. Except instead of saying heaven and earth, it's righteousness, which is God's covenant faithfulness, and then peace, which is the result. And then in the first half of the verse 10, it's hesed and emet, steadfast love and truth. And again, these words are hard to translate, but God's steadfast love then requires truthfulness. And that's when the earth, it's as in Psalm 67, when God is merciful to us and bless us, then the earth will produce its fruit. And so it's this sense of heaven and earth coming together.
It's a convergence.
Exactly. And that we are called to live at the dangerous intersection of heaven and earth, at the point where we are people who are relying on God's faithfulness and so becoming reliable, truthful, peaceful people ourselves. And that whole psalm actually is a psalm about the return from exile, but then some stuff still needs to happen. And that's part of the puzzle of the return from exile, as we call it, that God was gracious. He did bring the people back from Babylon. They did restart the temple, etc. But still all was not well. And so Psalm 85 I see as a prayer which leads all the way to Anna and Simeon in the temple in the beginning of Luke's gospel. They're still praying these psalms, and then God shows up, and steadfast love and faithfulness and righteousness and peace kissing each other. Here are Mary and Joseph coming with this little child, and Simeon says he's the one.
We started off this series talking about God coming to dwell with us, and you talked kind of in the introduction to this about how it's hard to understand that without understanding the temple. And one of the things that you've helped me in your work has been the understanding of heaven and earth overlapping and interlocking with one another. Help us to understand that imagery of what the temple is and how that Jesus is that embodiment in human form.
When I first started stumbling into temple theology, as you might put it, this was very difficult for me to get my head round, because I had grown up with this idea of God being basically distant, and then we have these things called souls which can visit God from time to time and might eventually go and live with him. This is basically Platonism, but Platonism in Christian language. Then discovering that actually in the ancient world, the reason why people built a temple was so that this would be a place, a trysting place, as in the Old English language, a place where heaven and earth would come together. And I remember articulating this years ago and feeling it difficult to articulate, that it wasn't as if you were in heaven when you were in the temple. You were in heaven, that the two spheres or circles were intersecting, and we were in the bit in the middle where heaven and earth were actually together. So it wasn't that in the temple you had a hotline to heaven. Heaven had a hotline to you. You were where they met. And that's where then the image language comes in. But then realizing that that's how Genesis 1 means what it means was so important for me. I don't know when it was, 20 years ago, I first was reading up this stuff. And because, as I've said before, in the Western Protestant world, we don't like to think of temples because we don't think of ourselves in terms of churchianity. We don't think of our church as a temple, or some of us may have done, but we've normally kind of frowned on that. It's not the building, it's the people. In fact, in the mercy of God, we still do have sacred spaces. It's just we don't always acknowledge them as such. But the point then is that in the temple in Jerusalem, heaven and earth really came together at that point, which is why the destruction of the temple was so devastating, as it meant the fracturing of the relationship between heaven and earth. But it then is why, when Jesus comes, and John says in John chapter 1, the Word became flesh, and in Greek, kai eskenosen en hemin, he pitched his tent in our midst. That's a tabernacle word. Jesus is the true temple. And people say, oh, Tom, you're just making that up with that Greek word. No, look at the next chapter. John says he spoke of the temple of his body. And the temple image goes all the way through John's gospel. Jesus is the place where heaven and earth have come together. That's part of what it means to say he's fully divine and fully human. And when he says that you must live in me and I must live in you, that is that we are to be temple people ourselves. And that's the extraordinary challenge. We are people who are designed as image bearers to live at the intersection of heaven and earth and to celebrate that intersection in all the things that we're supposed to be doing. And so the mercy and truth which meet together, that's an agenda for the church. So all those prayers about restore us again, as we pray those prayers for ourselves, for the church, and then a lovely line in verse 8, let me hear what the Lord God will speak. These are my troubles. I've just said we're in difficulties, but let's see what God's going to say. He will speak peace to his people and to his faithful, to those who turn to him in their hearts. And then this convergence will happen again and again and again, until finally, in the New Jerusalem, heaven and earth are totally one.
What a dream, and a dream that will come true, a vision of what is to come. Tom, thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being a part of our Peachtree podcast this year as we focus on what it means to dwell with God and for God to dwell with us as we learn and pray through the Psalms. For more information and to see some discussion questions for this month, as well as to connect with us, we would love to see you at peachtreechurch.com.